My name is Ruben Nelson, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this KCOR weekly webinar series. KCOR is the oldest continuing Canadian organization with a passion for our future. This webinar series is now in its third year, and in my view, it's the most interesting and reliable weekly webinar series for folks who are focused on the future, seek to understand in a reliable way what we're in for, what the future will require of us, and what we can be doing to respond with courage. Today, our speaker is Darrel Rowledge. You may not know him. He's not a man who seeks the limelight, but you should know him and his work. So I invite you to listen deeply and then engage from that same place with him afterwards. He is a systems thinker, thinking about the major crises that we face as a species. He's one of the few, in my experience, who has an extraordinary range of capabilities, from the basic physics, chemistry, and biology of the situation we're in to a global perspective. And what's more, he has a capacity for reflexivity, that is, for being self-consciously self-aware, not just of himself as a person, but of us as a culture. This is a skill that is still all too rare in our society. He is going to talk today about paradigm change and what he has learned over a lifetime. I came to know him through a mutual friend, David Swan, and I've come to respect him deeply, enjoy time with him, and I hope you will do the same. If you wish to raise a question after he has spoken, please indicate in the chat that you have a question and what your question is. And then after Darrell's finished, we will carry on with the Q&A. Darrell, a warm welcome to KCOR. Looking forward to learning from you and with you. Over to you.
Thank you, Ruben. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've been a kind of quiet admirer of KCOR for some time. I need to first begin by acknowledging my First Nations partners, in particular Piikani, that I've worked with for a very long time, but we're also associated with the Assembly of First Nations. And I'll bring the usual greeting that I was taught in Blackfoot from friends there. Oke Niguu Aksa Sugapi. Now, I'm told that this is not offensive or anything, that it's all good. But at the end of the day, I also know about their sense of humor, so take it for what it is. The thesis that I'm putting forward is actually pretty simple story, and the aspirations are not that great. It's just trying to figure out how to save humanity. So the core of what I've been trying to do is figure out how in the world we keep doing this. And the essence is, if I had to put it in a nutshell, that we've forgotten how to be wise. But we need to begin with the description and question about, so what is wisdom? And I think it's pretty simple, actually. It's a combination of both intelligence, science, evidence, that kind of thing, and ethics. So the essence of what I've been looking at for a long time has led me to the thesis that I put up for this talk. And this is my first time through this talk, so it's going to be interesting. This is a new deck. But in essence, the thing is that every time we look at a crisis, it turns out that the great crises of humanity are caused by humans. More accurately, they're caused by men. And what's worse, when you look deeply, it's happening by design. So the essence is that this is so serious now, as was just in the discussion. We're facing the Anthropocene racing to collapse. So everything that I've ever looked at suggests that solving man-made problems requires change, not just of the dysfunctional systems. And you'll notice in the slide that I put DYS, the dis part, in parentheses. And there's a reason for that. Because the systems are functioning perfectly according to the measures and metrics that have been assigned to them, but they nevertheless lead to catastrophe. So the essence is that we're going to have to solve by eliminating these dysfunctional systems, but the only way we can do that is to change the underlying thinking that created them in the first place. We've been trying for the longest time to solve problems without either changing the systems or the thinking that created them. And it, as far as I'm concerned, has not worked. We're going to hell faster. So my belief that I've come to test over and over and over again with the assistance of and the privilege of learning from First Nations elders all over is that we have to restore our holistic and collaborative approach to thinking. We need to remember how to be wise. We have to restore this and then use a comprehensive analysis to be able to figure out how to actualize and achieve our real goals and our real values. So to look at this in the simplest terms, we have to figure out how to get what we want and avoid what we don't. And the current system is set up pretty much all toward the want side of the equation. And it leads to my joke that the proof of this, the dysfunction of this system, is that everything is focused on the want side, that it's the only side that monetizes. And proof of that is that abstinence is not the oldest profession. So the essence of what we're dealing with, I put forward in brief terms to the One Health Congress in 2018. So the One Health Congress that was the 5th meeting, I believe. It's only held every 2 years. And it was the first time that they had divided into 3 pillars of the One Health approach, which is holistic. They were looking at antimicrobial resistance, and they were examining the science policy interface. So at the One Health Congress, I was there to address a prion disease like mad cow that was on the agenda. And so the people, if you look at the slide, include some of the greatest prion scientists in the world. I was there to discuss the public policy interface. So this is the actual deck that I presented there. So the essence was that I was trying to make the point that chronic wasting disease, this prion disease like mad cow that turns out to be highly contagious, wasn't an accident. It was the result of a public policy catastrophe. So I had to go through it it was, to my knowledge, the first time that there was a real chance to be able to discuss the science policy interface. So the question is, okay, so what is that? It's the essence of political science and governance, but this is essentially all grounded in the public trust doctrine. And the core of that is to be found in the basis of the philosophy of law. It turned out to be that the public trust doctrine was established in law by the United States Supreme Court in 1842. But I think that the easiest way to go through this is to just tell a story. So the question of the public trust doctrine and how we got here is a thing that I call the greatest story never told. So if you think back a couple hundred years, a little bit more, in 1801, Thomas Jefferson is elected president of the United States, and he sends Lewis and Clark out on their amazing journey to document the geography, the people, the resources, and so on of the continent. And if you read their journals, they ran out of words to describe the wildlife that they saw. It was absolutely amazing. 60 million bison, 40 million antelope, so many birds that it would blacken out the sky. Okay, well, fast forward 100 years, 1901, Vice President Teddy Roosevelt is hunting in the Adirondacks when President McKinley is assassinated. And the response of the Washington press corps was, oh, great, now that damn cowboy is president. But what was really interesting is that when that was kind of astonishing for anybody who paid any attention to conservation, because he's the conservation president. But the reality at the time was that all of that wildlife was at the brink of extinction. So the Roosevelt administration and Prime Minister Laurier pulled together, they brought in the best scientists to try to figure out what happened. They held a series of continental congresses on wildlife, trying to figure out what happened. Well, it didn't take them very long, because this is the kind of thing that they found. This is a wagon load of elk on its way to market. Here are just a few bison skulls that were going to market. There were more birds on the feathers of ladies' hats than there were in the wild at that time, all going to market. They realized that if you put a price on the head of something that's dead, that's what you get. So Canada and the United States brought in desperate measures, laws to try to protect the wildlife. And again, this was based in the public trust doctrine. It was taken all the way to the Supreme Court in Martin v. Waddell, and it established public trust at the core of all governance. And even though there was a dispute, the Supreme Court said that essentially the role of government was grounded in public trust. And there's a bunch of principles of that we don't have time to get into. But essentially, the tragedy that had happened was this problem of perspective. They didn't see the coming tragedy. Now, I'll go into this a little bit more in more detail, but this is what Garrett Hardin called the tragedy of the commons. So in essence, what he was saying was that this tragedy occurred because of disproportionate return, that this happened where if everybody was allowed, for example, to add another cow to a common pasture, all the benefits of adding the cow went to the owner of the cow, but the depletion of the resource of the commons, the common pasture, was shared by the many. And he said that this explained the tragedy of the commons. So, well, first of all, he was mistaken about this. These factors play in, but the greatest ever, some of the greatest tragedies of the commons have occurred all on private land. There's no old growth forest left in private hands in the United States. It's only on common property, on the national forests. The greatest ever loss of biodiversity in history is our arable land base, and it's all occurring on private land. So the ratio is just not there. I think that this is a result of what I call micro market myopia. So that there is a micro vision and narrow focus. It's all measured in marketplaces and with using proxies for value like money, and it's done over the short term. It's myopic. You put it all together and you end up not being able to see the coming tragedy. So the essence of the question is, okay, so is there a solution to this? Of course, you have to do comprehensive analysis. You have to look not just narrowly, you have to look broadly. You have to understand that biology and business are not just both needed to be considered. One is a complete subset of the other. There are no businesses absent the environment. And then, of course, you have to look not just short term, you have to look long term. This is essentially what they were doing when they were looking at the laws to protect wildlife. And my longtime mentor, recently passed away, Professor Val Geist, later described all of this, these laws that came together as a model. He called it the North American model of wildlife conservation. And it had 7 principles. The first, of course, was the public wildlife as a public resource, confirmed in the Supreme Court. The second was that they prohibited the marketing of vulnerable wildlife. They said that if there's going to be allocation of wildlife, it has to be by law. You have to get a license. There was going to be equal opportunity for all, which should be only killing for legitimate cause, for meat or wildlife management. Unfortunately, part of what had killed the wildlife off is that, for example, you could buy a shooting chair on a train and they would give you a gun and ammunition and you could shoot the hell out of anything. And obviously the train's not stopping to pick up the bounty. There was a recognition that wildlife is an international resource that crosses boundaries. And then they put in place what they called science as the basis of policy. This became known as the Roosevelt Doctrine. So what was the success of this? What happened? This is the greatest environmental success in the history of the planet. And it replenished an entire continent full of wildlife, even though the markets for wildlife still existed outside of North America at the time. And when we got wildlife back, we ended up stumbling into the golden goose, because here you ended up with a sustainable resource that provided all these amazing benefits, including all of the economic development that grew up around enjoying this continent full of wildlife. They're making and selling a mountain of outdoor equipment and so on, providing services. And this money is tracked by the National Wildlife Service and the Department of the Interior in the United States. And this is well over $150 billion every year, the value of it. Now, you could kill every living thing in terms of wildlife and dump it into the market, and you wouldn't get that even in 1 year, and we get that every year. But there were 2 additional benefits that I don't even know how you put a price on. The first was that if you're going to protect wildlife as a public resource that's valuable only when it's alive, that there's an implicit demand to protect habitat and biodiversity. So I don't know how you even put a price tag on that. The second is that protecting wildlife as a public resource turned out to protect the health of the wildlife, and it turned out to have huge benefits for us as well, because of a factor that people weren't really aware of. It was that most and almost all of our infectious diseases have been transferred to us from animals. But there's a mystery involved in this, and it has 2 parts. First, diseases don't easily transfer between species. I mean, it's even hard to do in the lab, right? And the second is that it's even more challenging to get a disease that crosses the species barrier and then is transferable or contagious in that new species. So if those 2 things are true, and they are, how in the world do we explain that most of our diseases come from animals? Well, it's because of this, the genesis of new pathogens. This is Jared Diamond's book, came out in the mid-90s, I believe 1997. What was interesting is that we were investigating this. I had been investigating this for about 7 years at that time, with the privilege of learning from some of the best pathologists, wildlife pathologists in the world, in Wyoming and Colorado and various places, Wisconsin and so on. And I made a mistake that was kind of funny. I falsely presumed that the word that pathogenesis refers to the genesis of a pathogen. It turns out that that was not true. Tom Thorne laughed. He thought that was, it was kind of interesting. It was not like oncogenesis, what causes cancer. This word emerged long before we knew about bacteria and viruses, and it was describing how diseases manifest. Nevertheless, we were investigating this in pretty significant detail. And it turned out that it has a whole bunch of different factors that work together. And this is all going to come together that people will appreciate given COVID. So the first factor that we're dealing with is, the first factor of captivity is stress. So what happens when you catch a wild animal? Well, it's terrified, right? It's its heart is racing, its blood pressure sky high, its respirations are up, it's pumping stress hormones, epinephrine and cortisol. It's directing blood flow to the large muscle masses. All of these things are designed to get it ready to fight or flee for its life. And that is a survival mechanism. But chronic stress is controlled by the same endocrine system, and it compromises both our innate and adaptive immune systems. And in fact, now there are two new areas of science, psychoneuroendocrinology and psychoneuroimmunology, that are looking in particular at humans as to how and why stress makes us more susceptible to diseases and we suffer them more severely. And that was, again, reaffirmed in COVID. But that's just the beginning. So in captivity, you have immunocompromised animals, and then all of the rest of these factors come into play. First, you end up with high density. There, thousands of animals sometimes, all crowded together. The exposure is massive. You have to feed these animals large portions of the year, so that means you have to store grasses and grains, and that attracts all manner of rodents. And they bring along all of their diseases and parasites in that biological soup. The animals are living in squalor. Very often feedlots, it's just, ankle deep manure. And then there are surfaces, or so-called fomites, that can transfer disease. This people will recognize from when we were washing our groceries during COVID. And then there are all manner of vectors, so insects and so on, that can transfer diseases. So immediately you end up with Mother Nature starting selection. So the vulnerable animals die off, the hardy ones live on, and it starts this arms race between the pathogens and the hosts, right? But then we add to this because we start husbandry, we start selecting for what we want. We want more eggs, more milk, more wool, more meat, that kind of thing. And so we start genetically breeding to get what we want. And the consequence of this is that we don't just change the animals on the outside, we change them on the inside. So what happens to their brain is absolutely astonishing. So this is Australian National University examined wild animals versus their domestic counterparts. There's a few here. The best example I know is sheep. Domestic sheep's brain is 50% smaller than a wild sheep. So the average is over 30%. And then, of course, we take these animals and we transport them all over the place. And when you're moving an animal, you're moving everything in it that lives in it or on it. All of the diseases and the parasites and the genes and the proteins, everything is being moved into a new environment with a whole new set of things that can put into the mix. You put all these factors together and you get this domestication disease accelerator. So this is a relentless accelerator of both the hosts and the pathogens. Now, the big red arrows indicate that the pathogens tend to get more infectious and the hosts get more resistant. But the arrows can actually go the other direction as well. There's no biological reason that you wouldn't end up with a more harmful, a more virulent pathogen as well. It would just not spread as quickly. So what are the implications of all this? Well, if you look at the best example that I know of, which was sheep, University of Washington at Pullman did this experiment where they took 6 wild sheep, healthy, all maintained so that they were tested and they were all healthy, and 6 domestic sheep, and they just penned them together to see, they co-housed them to see what would happen. The first bighorn was dead in 4 days. The last one was dead in 71 days. And you don't have to do this experiment anymore. It's been done over and over and over again. And UC Davis collated, put it together, all of the data, and 100% of the wild sheep will die from diseases that domestics don't even know they have, right? So if that's sheep, what about people? So here are a few of the diseases that have come to humans. They're so-called zoonotic diseases because they originate in wildlife and they've come to people. The domestication has played a role in all of the ones in red. So if you look at all the way down toward the bottom, I had to add to the COVID-18 the coronavirus that had appeared in SARS and MERS, because this was, one of the diseases that I raised at the 2018 One Health Congress is a coronavirus that had gone from Chinese horseshoe bats into palm civets that were kept in captivity by the hundreds of thousands in Guangdong. It super evolved and jumped to people, and it was SARS in 2003. Nobody paid any attention, happened again in 2012. And these versions of the coronavirus were vastly more virulent than COVID-19. SARS killed 10% of the people that were infected. MERS was even worse. 34% of the people who got that died. So when COVID-19, when it's all said and done now, the total mortality is probably under 1%. So one of the things that was pretty astonishing to me is that during the North American Wildlife Congress, C. Gordon Hewitt, Canada's national zoologist, contracted the 1918 flu, and it took his healthy life in 9 days, 5 days after his 35th birthday. So, the lessons were there. Where did the Spanish flu come from? It was a combination. Probably the most recent transfer was from domestic fowl. But the work of these scientists went on. Hewitt's book, The Conservation of the Wildlife of Canada, was published posthumously by his wife. And then all of it was basically just forgotten. Unfortunately, all that wildlife was just taken for granted, and Geist had not figured out the North American model. He hadn't even pulled it together until the mid-1980s. But during the same time, in the 1980s, there was an initiative brought forward to take advantage of exploiting wildlife in captivity, so-called captive wildlife. There was the introduction of a proposal to not just return to the market, but to domesticate wildlife for profit. They called it game farming. So the question is, okay, so why are they doing this? They had 4 products, initially breeding stock, but that's basically a pyramid scheme. There were 4 primary products: venison, velvet, urine, and shooters. If you go through these in order, there was no market for venison. It was not sufficient enough to even justify building the specialized slaughter facilities, because these are extremely athletic animals. They're going to jump fences and break legs and so on. Velvet, it was being sold into the Orient as an aphrodisiac. This is the practice of removing living, growing bone tissue. This is what it looks like. These photographs were taken in Alberta. Velvet is living, growing bone tissue, and this is mutilation. This is probably as painful for an elk to have this done as it is for one of us to have a limb amputated. And even if they attempt to use anesthesia, the post-operative pain has been described by people that it can include phantom pain. It's unbearable. People have had lobotomies trying to get rid of post-operative bone pain. Anyway, what has to be asked is, what is this for? It was being sold into the Orient as an aphrodisiac. There's absolutely no evidence that it works. It's nothing more than placebo or magic, is what I called hocus erectus. It needs to be noted that living, growing bone tissue can carry all manner of diseases, including chronic wasting disease. So the next product is urine, where they would take domestic deer, typically, and pen them up over a grate and collect the urine. Again, this is enormously stressful to these animals. And the purpose is just completely frivolous. I've hunted my entire life. I've never used this. It's ridiculous. You don't need it. The final and most lucrative market was for shooters. This is where they breed these super mutant antlered animals that, you know, are targeted as captive targets for a pet shoot, essentially. So this is, you know, like capital amusement, I guess. I don't know. The proposal was being based in economics, but in fact, they had done no economic analysis. So when I pressed the Alberta government, I had actually known quite a bit about economics at the time. I'd done micro and macro and natural resource economics, petroleum economics and stuff. So I asked the government a bunch of questions about that any economist would ask. And it turned out that they blurted out that I couldn't see their benefit cost analysis because they didn't do one. There was one government in the world that ever actually looked at this in detail. It was in Wyoming because the wildlife scientists were there. This is a shot of that paper on the left is Alberta's 11-page thin white paper. The word disease appears in there once. And on the right is the comprehensive analysis that was done by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. My friend Bob Lenka was the chairman. I was actually invited down and I was debating with the heir to the Campbell Soup fortune, John Dorrance III, who wanted to start, this whole process in Wyoming began because he wanted to build this massive game farm at the foot of the Devil's Tower Monument. Anyway, the conclusions of the Wyoming analysis was that game farming had all of these amazing threats that were hugely detrimental. Diseases and parasites and genetic pollution, habitat loss, the destruction of the North American system, wildlife conservation, all of the economic costs, the policy disasters. This was just abhorrent. It was massively opposed by First Nations. Here are a few of the letters of protesting. They said it was an affront to their most sacred belief. Chief Beaver, for example, looked at a bunch of what I laid in front of him, of what was happening. He said, what the hell is this? Now they want to put animals on reservations. Nevertheless, the government in Alberta rammed it through. And politically, it was compromised because friends and relatives of cabinet ministers had gotten in on the ground floor of the breeding pyramid before it was ever legalized. And then they stuffed the ballot box to ram it through. Nevertheless, they got it through. This is what we got. This is a picture taken in Alberta. This is not a natural setting. This is high stress. If one of these animals gets a disease, they're all going to get it. It took less than 3 years for this to be a disaster. We had a massive outbreak of bovine tuberculosis on game farms across Canada, 4 different provinces. It went to cattle, it went to pigs, it went to bison, and 42 people had to begin treatment for tuberculosis just because of the exposure on elk farms in Alberta. This cost tens of millions of dollars trying to clean up, all taxpayer money, and the game farmers were compensated at market value. It was crazy. And in the process, Canada lost TB-free status as a nation for all of agriculture that was worth $1 billion. This is a picture from Colorado. We had imported infected elk from several places. There were no adequate live animal tests. That was known at the time. But we didn't even have this epidemic cleaned up before in 1996. 2 things happened almost the same day that shocked us to the core. The spring of 1996, the UK government had to go before Parliament and admit that people were dying from mad cow disease, so-called variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. This is John Gummer, the then Minister of Ag, trying to convince people that the beef was safe to eat because of the threats to their markets. Almost the same day, the Canadian government had to admit that CWD, chronic wasting disease, another prion disease in this family of transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, had been confirmed on a game farm in Saskatchewan. So these prion diseases are really unique, and it's worth understanding that this is a different kind of pathogen, and they're clearly something that is the result of captivity and domestication. There are no known epidemic prion diseases in wild species. There's no scrapie in wild sheep. There's no evidence of BSE in wild bovids. And there's no evidence of CWD It was not here before it was transferred from game farms. So, or from captivity. The initial one was found in Fort Collins, Colorado, in a research lab. This exploded all over the place, as you'll see in a bit, but was so severe that in 2001, it was declared a state of emergency by the US Secretary of Agriculture, Ann Veneman. But it ended up exploding because there was no containment, there was no contact tracing of where this came from. So this is a slide that I put together because the first finding occurred in 1996 down by Regina, and they depopulated the farm, but they didn't bother to figure out where it came from. Then it showed up down by Swift Current again in 1998, and then again in 2000. And during all this time, they refused, Agriculture Canada refused to figure out where it came from. When it happened again in 2000, they finally looked at it and they realized that all of it had come from an index farm up by Lloydminster that had imported elk from South Dakota. And in the 4 years that they hadn't bothered to look at it, they had shipped animals to 40 different herds and they infected 21 of them. And it spread all over the place. By 2007, the Alberta government was so concerned about this that they put helicopters in the air, and we shot 10,000 deer on our border with Saskatchewan. They filled massive pits. This is what it kind of looked like, and it was created a huge uproar. So because the governments were refusing all of our pleas to look at this, they said there was no evidence of this. So I wrote this book and sent it to governments. I didn't release it to the public, pointing out that this was a public policy disaster. I put the book in a 3-ring binder with all the documenting science, and I sent it to all the governments in the relevant provinces and to the feds. So the essence of this is that CWD is a failure of governance, not science. We should have known better. And recently, we've had a bunch of problems with the potential impacts of this because of the particular nature of prions. Prions are not a bacterium. They're not a virus. They're just a misfolded protein. We produce the natural cellular protein, PRPC, that is useful for a bunch of things that are not yet understood, but it is normally in an alpha helix formation. Our body can break it down. But in this misfolded form, in mad cow disease, in chronic wasting disease, in the human version of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, these misfolded proteins collapse from an alpha helix formation fold into this beta-pleated sheet formation, and it's all but indestructible. So one of the concerns is that because it doesn't break down, because it's smaller than the smallest known viruses, what about the possibility of this coming up from infected soil into plants? So this was done in 2 different labs, Chris Johnson in Wisconsin, Claudio Soto in Texas, and it was confirmed. So you can get prions onto plants, into plants, and there's basically no way to get rid of it. CWD presents a threat to deer all over the world. So the people that are looking at this have been extremely concerned that they don't want this in their deer, infecting their environment, threatening their ecosystems and their wildlife and their economies, their agriculture, and potentially their people. So this is how big it got by 2018 when I presented this to the One Health Congress. And for comparison, I put an in-scale map of the UK into this slide. It needs to be pointed out that the UK would fit completely within the state of Wyoming. It's even bigger than this now. So when the governments wouldn't respond, they said my book was too long and too complicated. So with some co-authors, we put this into a comprehensive white paper, and we sent it to governments. And the descriptions were that this is, because it's so highly contagious, it's insidious and it's dire. And if it ever jumps to people, who the hell knows what would happen? Because this is 100% fatal and highly contagious. So we didn't barely have this paper off the printing press when some news that was more than disturbing was released by Dr. Stephanie Trube and Herman Schetzel out of the University of Calgary in work that was sponsored by Agriculture Canada and the University of Calgary, and it was done in partnership with the world-class primate research facility in Germany. They tested the closest non-human primates were allowed to use in research, cynomolgus macaques, and they transferred disease to 2 of 3 just from eating a relatively modest portion of meat. So we had to write this up as another paper as a follow-up, Dr. Paul Sockett and I, but we just added the word urgent to the paper. This is our update, and we outlined a bunch of different things that disturbing pieces of news that indicated that this was more than likely going to be possible to transfer to people. There are no known biological reasons why it couldn't happen. So the recommendations to contain this were pretty simple. We had to stop the geographic spread of this, stop the movement in any form, living or dead, which would mean we'd have to shut down the game farming industry, because you can't have an industry if you can't move animals or sell product. We would have to stop the movement of carcasses from hunters. And then we needed to be able to stop this from going to the food and feed chains. And we would desperately need a comprehensive analysis to try to figure out what to do. But the essence of what I was presenting to the One Health Congress and here today, because the same thing is happening, is that CWD is not the problem. We're creating all these disasters, and it is we of the West, the modern Western economies that I'm going to talk about in more detail, because of the dysfunction in the systems that we've put together. So we have to get beyond this to be able to prevent future occurrences. And we have to expose the flawed reductionist-competitivist paradigm and its systems. So to put in scale, though, where we are in terms of wild systems, wild ecosystems, and our domestic ones, our synthetic systems, I got this from Paul McCready, who did a TED Talk about this. He was an aeronautical engineer. He's the one that did the Gossamer Albatross, the first human-powered flight across the English Channel. But as he was advancing in age, he was really worried about the planet and his grandchildren. So he did this examination of the wild systems of natural systems, wild animals, and the portion that is humans, livestock, and pets. So 10,000 years ago, the portion of wildlife was massive. Humans, livestock, and pets made up about 1/10 of 1%. So, but this changed pretty dramatically. This is the graph, and because I had done this, my book was in 2008. This is where we are. The vast majority of this is vertebrates on land and in the air, not fish. So this was the essence of what my talk was about. I finished with this slide saying, okay, so, you know, are we going to have tragedy or triumph? This is our choice. We have to do this on purpose. So there's some additional information here about that was not available, and the rest of this deck was created after 2018. So first is the growth of this. So I put together kind of a growing slide deck series so that you can see where this came from. There's only one indication in 1967, that was Fort Collins in captivity at the research facility in Fort Collins. So here's what happened, and the yellow dots are all captive facilities. After they found this in this captive herd, unfortunately in Fort Collins, they did 2 things that turned out to be a mistake, but they didn't know what they were dealing with. They turned some of the animals from research back loose into the wild, and they sent some to the Denver Zoo. And from there, every yellow dot going forward is a game farm, and every all the gray is an indication of where it went in the wild. So this is where it went. You can see it spreading wide every place that it's gone. So this is where we are today. This is the world's largest mass of infectious prions. It is unbelievably large, and it's still spreading. They just found it in the wild in Oklahoma. I got a note this morning. We're still not containing this. Not only are the deer farms able to move live animals, and there are no adequate live animal tests, hunters are moving carcasses. So my friend Brian Richards at the National Wildlife Health Center tracked just 4 counties infected in Wisconsin, and he put the zip codes together in a map as to where the animals went from these infected, where the carcasses went from these infected counties. So, and this is from 4 counties in one state. So you can only imagine where all of this has been transferred. And when you throw the carcass out behind the barn or in the coulee or in the landfill or whatever, it creates what we've come to call a super site. So this is Herman Schutzel. He's at the lab, at the Prion lab, that did the research, and he's about to publish this research. And the essence was that in these macaques, it created full-blown prion disease. This was then proven with bioassays. It's irrefutable. There's no question these macaques were infected with CWD. So we hope that there is something of a genetic barrier that will protect people, but there's no biological reason why this couldn't change. And there are a whole bunch of side doors around barriers. For example, you can't transfer CWD directly into a hamster, but if you passage it through a ferret first, it works perfectly. So intermediate species present a problem. So recently, there's been a bunch of new developments that are really concerning. This one just came out last fall. It turns out that people or animals that have been subjected to COVID-19 are more susceptible to prion disease. And COVID-19 has been found massively now in our white-tailed deer populations. Of course, they got it from the same place that we did, originally from China, then from people. And this is what we're dealing with, though, when we're looking at infectious pathogens. So this is a measure that is combining 2 things: the deadliness that's shown here on the vertical axis, on the x-axis. The deadliness is, or sorry, the y-axis. The mortality or deadliness goes up, right? And the contagiousness or infectivity is on the horizontal axis. So if you look at something like chickenpox, for example, it's right in the middle on the lower axis. This is really highly infectious. It has an R0, a reproductive number of about 8.5. In other words, the average person that's infected transfers it to about 8 people, right? But nobody dies from chickenpox. It's pretty mild. You get a rash. I had it when I was a kid, not a big deal. This is what happens with some of the other pathogens. So if you look over toward the left-hand corner, you see the 1918 flu, right? It had a mortality that was a little bit more, but it had an R0, a reproductive number, about 2.5. Somewhere between 50 and 75 million people died from the Spanish flu. So COVID-19 is right, ahead of it in terms of infectivity, but nowhere near as many people have died, not just because it's a lot less lethal, but because we've developed vaccines. So if you look at SARS and MERS, they didn't kill that many people, but they were vastly more lethal. So then you look at prion disease, like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It's against the corner. It's on the left-hand side. It's 100% lethal, but it's not contagious. But if you look in the upper right-hand corner, that's where CWD is in deer. It's off the charts. It's 100% lethal. And we don't know it doesn't just pass between animals. It can go animal to plant, animal to soil, and it stays in the environment indefinitely. We're like 20 years and counting, and you can't get rid of it. It is so resilient, it withstands almost any attempt to try to disinfect it. So the essence of this problem is that, again, we're not looking at this in a comprehensive way. We're not asking, where the hell did this come from? What do we need to do? We're not asking what if or if what. So what if this happens? And then if it does happen, what do we do? What's our plan? What are the consequences? We've not even done that with the economic analyses. So we tried to get, I did a presentation to the board of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, tried to get them to do an economic analysis. For whatever reason, they actually didn't do a full-blown economic analysis of the worst case scenarios. They repurposed old research, and there's a story behind that that we don't have time to get into. But if we think back to 1996, when it was first diagnosed on a game farm in Saskatchewan, I called Beth Williams, and she was the scientist that proved that chronic wasting disease is a prion disease in this family of transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And I said, so they've confirmed this on this game farm. What the hell are we going to do when this gets into the wild? Because you're not going to contain this. And so she said, well, you're going to have to cut, you're going to have to stop it. First of all, you can't move it. And then you're going to have to cut wider and deeper than you ever think is necessary. She said, the deer will come back, but you're going to have one chance. If you don't, if you let it get established, you're going to have it for a long time. So this is the research that's just come out that shows that SARS infected people are more susceptible to prion disease. That's a huge concern, but it returns back to the thesis that I'm putting forward, which is that the great problems of humanity are caused by humans, and they're happening by design. And so I'm suggesting that they're happening because the systems are doing it on purpose, essentially. And that the only way to solve this is to understand that it's happening, to discern what the thinking is, like the flawed thinking behind it, the paradigm, and then restore the paradigm that allowed us to survive, that I call a collaborative and holistic thing, approach. And we have to do a comprehensive analysis to try to figure out how to achieve our actual goals and our actual values. So I'd like to go through these in a little bit more detail. The first, of course, is what's a paradigm? That's just it's a worldview. Elders describe it as a way of thinking, knowing, and being. And I don't know how you improve on that. So the first is the holistic collaborative approach, and I want to talk about that. And the second is this, what we've had now for the last, increasingly over the last 100 years, a reductionist-competitivist, self-inflicted blindness. So the first is this, hang on, I can't get my slide to advance here. Okay, so the first is the holistic collaboration. And I call this the superpower of Homo sapiens. And I call it that because there was a conundrum, an evolutionary oddity. Humans are not bigger, stronger, faster, or more ferocious. We somehow managed to survive despite becoming weaker and more vulnerable. And it's a longer story, but in essence, this begins with the essence of learning and cognition, probably in species a long time before us. But it begins with the essence of learning, that every living being, we're born into the middle of ongoing process. We don't get to watch the movie from the beginning. We're born into the middle of ongoing process. So we have to try and figure it out. We have to learn to take advantage of choice, to make decisions to get better odds. So because we're born into the middle, we're naturally we're privileged to have a holistic view. We see everything, and then we start to discern cause and effect. We are able to distill out, make inferences from what we see and hear and learn, and we can derive better decisions. And this is all amplified in our species as what I call the superpower, because it combines cooperation. I mean, the only way that we survived was cooperating. By definition, that involves more than one being. So the other part of it was that cooperation is facilitated enormously with communication. And we put all this together, and it ended up being the superpower of Homo sapiens, because we weren't just able with cooperation and collaboration to take advantage of multiple sets of senses, more eyes and ears, more brains, more cognition, but we were able to, with the development of language, we were able to develop stories. We were able to tell stories that became traditional knowledge. This is where we tapped into this amazing magic of breaking another dimension. We were able to bridge time. We were able to take advantage of the knowledge of thousands of generations past, to use that past information to anticipate the future in order to make better decisions in the present, which is why I believe it's the superpower of Homo sapiens. I think it's the only reason that we managed to survive. Unfortunately, we've basically replaced that with its mirror image. So we're now functioning under a reductionist-competitivist paradigm, and this is self-inflicted blindness, in my view. So we fragment and divide everything. Everything is siloed and specialized. We parse everything and we order everything. And then we presume that we should accept competitive self-interest as value. So the very essence of our values is incorporated into economics as value, right? Goods and services are good, as it were, right? So these become the essence of these proxies for value, and you put them all together and you end up with this reductionist competitivist paradigm and paradigmatic blindness, and it has consequences. So here are some of what we don't see. Of course, we don't see the tragedy of the commons because of micro-market myopia. We've set up synthetic systems, and the essence of them is the economies that we put together, the structures and institutions that we have, and they're all synthetic. And just as an example, the protection of public interest is collected in governance, in the media, and in academia. These are the so-called guardians of public interest. Governance that is supposed to protect the public interest, academia, that is where academics get tenure because we need to protect the best information that we have. They need to be able to speak out on important issues. And of course, we have to be able to have an informed, properly informed, with facts and evidence, voting public. So we have a responsibility of journalism to get qualified reporting into the public that's accurate and valid. Unfortunately, we're facing a reality where the markets that we've put together, they basically have no conscience. They have no foresight. So that's why we keep running into these. Markets they don't know where we're going, and they don't care. So did they see the subprime mortgage crisis coming? No, well, a few people did, but mostly people just missed it, right? But the people in the markets, as you will learn from the book, The Big Short, as well as the movie, people on the inside saw it coming. They actually tried to do something about it, but the markets ignored them, right? So then we have a problem of the essence of regulatory capture. This is where the interests of protecting the public through legislation and regulation has been compromised by private interest. So the best example I know is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which was funded massively to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars by the biggest corporations in the world. And they actually write legislation and then give it to legislators, and they copy paste it in, and it becomes law. we have a thing called, that I call the imposed compromise of scientific and ethical principles, where in my career trying to lobby for better outcomes, there are people at senior levels within government that are afraid to speak out on important issues or they'll lose their job. And there's so many examples of this that you can't enumerate them all. So I call this imposed compromise of scientific or ethical principles. I say people are working under exception. Then there's a legal dysfunction that's occurring. And this is because of what I call the paradox of innocence. This is the presumption that we always want to avoid type 1 error. We never want to punish an innocent party. So innocence is presumed until you can prove beyond any reasonable doubt. Well, a funny thing happened when corporations were presumed to be people and given the same result, the same rights, because you couldn't prove in a world of predominantly multi-factor causality, you couldn't prove that smoking caused a cancer in a particular case. It could have been a genetic predisposition. It could have been a whole number of things. So we ended up with case after case being dismissed, and the justices were forced to embarrassingly admit that unfortunately, it turns out that your particular loved one died generally, but not particularly. And it was only after the states began suing on behalf of their populations that all of the metadata came in, and then the comparison of smokers versus non led to the grand bargain in 1998, and the tobacco companies had to pay hundreds of billions of dollars to the states to because of the health costs. Then there are all of the same distortions and dysfunction that's occurring in the media, because it's been taken over by all of the private interests of profit. The same thing is happening in our political system that has been compromised by all of the above. And then as Senator Whitehouse has been pointing out recently in the United States, all of the above has applied to capture the court, where the Republicans were able to essentially use all of the above to capture the Supreme Court and have a supermajority. One of the examples that I was most astonished to find was the dysfunction in governance, because there was no professional conduct. There was no comprehensive analysis going on. And in fact, when I investigated it, not only did we not have one, our new members of parliament were advised that they weren't supposed to carefully examine policy. They were just supposed to tweak it. So I created this code of professional conduct for legislators. I had to actually write it because it didn't exist. This doesn't exist anywhere in the world, right? So this is the one that I proposed. You can see it here. I'm happy to send this to anybody that wants to see it. But it returns to the thesis of this talk that we're creating the crises that are killing us. We're doing it by design, and we have to change the paradigm. We have to restore our superpower to a holistic and collaborative approach. We have to do a comprehensive analysis to try to figure out how to put our values and our actual goals first, and then design new systems to be able to actualize those goals. So from where we are right now, what I'm proposing is that we have to do, in order to have any hope of doing any of this, we have to do a comprehensive systems dynamics analysis. But nobody's doing this. Nobody's even calling for it. So the question then is, and Ruben put this to me when I was first discussing it with him, he said, well, where is this going to happen? And I said, I don't know, because nobody's doing it. I said the UN, and he laughed. And anyway, so we have to answer if the thesis is correct and we know why all of this is happening, and we know the when part, because this needs to happen as soon as possible, then we're left with the three questions. How are we going to do this? Where are we going to do it? And who's going to do it? So that's the essence of what I'm proposing. And I'm happy to take any questions. So thanks for your attention.
I'm leaving a moment of silence because I expect others are kind of stunned into silence, given the relentless clarity with which you spoke. So as others formulate questions for you, or if you wish to make a comment and have Darrell respond to it, put it in the chat, because the only way I know you're there is by putting it in the chat. But let's you and I talk for a minute, Darrell, as others do that.
Can we stop the screen share so that we can see each other?
Sure. You have done that. So people, your slides are no longer up, and people can change their own view from speaker to gallery or whatever suits them.
Great, thank you.
And so others who have had their video off, leave your sound off until you're called upon. But if you want to put your video on so we can see your face, that's fine. Obviously, there's a host of questions, some of which we've talked about before, but the information that you've given today, some of it is new to me, just since we haven't talked for a while. I understand the directionality and agree with it. What I'm interested in is an equally kind of clear and unvarnished sense that you have of what do you think realistically, given the culture that we now have and the state that it's now in, that we will listen, we will do at last what you're suggesting we do, that real people backed by real money over time be assigned to take a deep, long, hard look at the nature of the trouble we're in, and to realize that it is far more deeply systemic than we now tell ourselves. We live in a culture that every troublesome situation is reduced to a problem, and problems by definition have solutions, and therefore from newscasts to speeches to just ordinary conversation, the language of problem solution is endemic. There is seldom heard, whether in newscasts or even in ordinary discourse, the kind of analysis that you offer, that we're not facing problems to be solved, we're facing a condition that we don't yet even understand. And a lot of that condition has to do with us. There was no hint, you're an Albertan, there was no hint in the last election that any of this would be true. Every political party, all 14 of them, promised that if elected, they understood our problems, they would fix them, and we could get on with our lives without changing our paradigms. So to put it bluntly, what chance do you see that your advice might actually be acted on, as opposed to we will be run over by tragedy?
So I think we have to make it so simple and so irrefutable that people can get it. So if we aspire to make wise choices, if we want to combine intelligence, science, and ethics, and I think that's what wisdom is, right? The only possible way to do that is to do comprehensive analysis. And we have the advantage now of fora like KCOR. There are phenomenal people that have gone into great depth on pretty much every crisis that we confront, So there are people that, are thought leaders, they have podcasts, they are digging into everything from metabolic health and how, and I didn't get into the essence of how we know that we've not just created most of the infectious pathogens that we suffer, there's now incredible evolutionary biology and metabolic analysis that shows that we are literally creating our chronic diseases as well. So all of the great killers that use up 75% of US healthcare budget, so insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, causing atherosclerosis, heart disease, cancers, neuropathologies, they're all now being linked to metabolic disorders, and all this science is coming together. And what's really fascinating for me is that it is a repetition of the same thing that happened with our paradigm. What were once survival mechanisms have been turned on their head. So to get back to your question though, because it's very astute, how are we going to have any confidence that we're going to be able to get traction? Well, people have incredible reach now. The thing that's been missing is that the people, we follow a bunch of the same people, I'm sure. So there are people that are dealing with everything from health and all of that to people that are deep into climate change. There are people into, the essence of economics and what's going on there. But the thing that I've not seen that was my last slide is, where are the calls for comprehensive systems dynamics analysis? Who's doing this? This has been the only thing that I've been finding this missing, because if we do that, then we can combine the best of science with our ethics to get what we actually want and avoid what we don't, right? So my hope is that the reach of if you look at a forum like KCOR and you look at all the rest of them that are available, if we ask what's going on, because the same thing is happening within our academic institutions, and I can chronicle with great detail how putting this in front of leading academics, as I've done at the University of Calgary, just because that's where I was. So the head of the Prion Lab, Herman Schetzel, the Dean of Law at the time, Al Lucas, the head of the Prion Lab, Herman Schetzel, his colleague, Sabine Gilch, they all signed our letter to the Prime Minister in 2019, right? Demanding, questing, begging for comprehensive analysis. It didn't happen, right? But there was pushback from academics who perceive a delve into the underlying policy as being political, right? So there was pushback to basically elbow us out of the room, right? So my hope is that we can get people to actually look upstream. So I know one of the people that we follow jointly is Nate Hagens, right? Brilliant stuff. The only request that I would have is join the demand for comprehensive analysis to test this thesis so that we can figure out, if we can get enough support, we can combine the forces of all of the best activists and experts from every single category to see if we can get this, to get these final three questions of, so how are we going to do this? Where are we going to do it? And who's going to be involved?
Thank you. I'm going to, Vic, I should have given you notice, but you've probably noticed in the chat that you're the first up. And so I'll invite you to turn on your camera and in just one sec, ask your question. And Paul Beckwith, you will be up after Vic. I want to return to this. I've not lost this, my question or your response to it, but let's open this up to others for a while and see where it takes us. So Vic, over to you.
Thank you very much. And first, Darrell, thank you for an excellent presentation. And before I raise my question, I'd like to make an observation on, how we're going to get this acted upon. And I guess my concern is that we can't do this on a sectoral basis. It's got to be a global undertaking. So how do you energize the global forum to collectively want to take action? And contrary to, with all due respect for Ruben, I do think the UN is an answer. I've been engaged personally with the UN for at least 30 years. And basically, we need an environmental security council that really engages everybody, an international forum, and can congeal experts on all of these aspects. It's one thing getting the studies done, it's another thing spreading the message and converting it into political messages. And now, you know, one of the obstacles, in my view, is the essence of money, the driving force. And I had personal experience with the introduction of GMOs. I chaired a meeting at Harvard University when it first started. And as a regulator, which was my assigned job, the problem was it was being introduced for economic driver reasons. And yet the environmental consequences weren't understood. And therefore, environmental protective action couldn't be undertaken or justified. And I think this is a paradigm, you know, that the question is not something to do to restrain money a major part of this, meaning money in the sense of economics driving the desire to save the planet.
So I concur wholeheartedly with all of that. And I share your concern about GMO, primarily because, you know, what it's allowed is massive use of glyphosate. And the whole background, if you dig into that health risk, is that, you know, it's been granted widespread use because humans don't have the shikimate pathway or the enzyme that is involved in this. You could take human cells and put them in a petri dish and they do just fine swimming in glyphosate. The problem is that we don't really know what the long-term impacts are, but we do know that the trillions of bacteria in our gut use that shikimate pathway. So do the trillions, countless tons of bacteria in our arable landscapes. So the greatest ever loss of biodiversity in global history is internally in our gut and externally in the microbiome of our arable land bases. And nobody's doing the math. And it's affecting everything in the environment as well. So this is what I mean by comprehensive systems dynamics analysis, where we have to take the broad long-term view and put everything together. I don't know enough about the UN. I respect it. It's a confederal organization that doesn't really have any power, but as a first step, we need to be able to get a lot more minds to being able to try to figure out how to secure this comprehensive analysis. And so we do have an offer outstanding right now. And I can't say a whole lot about it because it's just happening, but former Chief Dana Tijatram from Old Crow has potentially offered the ability to organize a first step in the Yukon in maybe even later this year.
Okay, thank you.
So Paul, ask one of your questions. And David Cargill, you will be up next.
Okay, so on the whole idea of domestication, there's, you know, it seems to go completely against biodiversity. And, you know, we've only domesticated terrestrial animals, maybe what, 10 or dozen or so. There's some talk of domesticating something like the whale shark in the ocean as a source of food to feed the, you know, huge numbers of people. So, you know, that's probably a very bad idea. Is that what you would say? To try to domesticate some other, you know, marine creatures, not just land creatures. Although maybe arguably from your last statement, we've domesticated some of the, our internal biome. You know, we've domesticated the bacteria in our guts in a way by reducing biodiversity of them.
Well, we definitely have. And fish farms are as big a disaster as can be described. My longtime friend, Alexandra Morton, has dedicated her life to trying to save the salmon fishery from the wild, healthy salmon fishery from salmon farms. They are fostering massive amounts of disease that are transferring into wild fish. We need to learn the lessons. The availability of a healthy resource harvested sustainably is just massively better biologically and economically. So we ignore all these lessons at our peril. We need to be able to put all this into context and examine things like regenerative agriculture, where we can restore what our arable land base was once a massive carbon and water sink. And we've now turned it into what Western science would call, this healthy, diverse, living soil. We've turned it into dead dirt. Now, you can't actually say that in terms of in Indigenous paradigm, because everything is living. It's a different way of looking at it. But nevertheless, we need to learn the lessons of trying to, quit changing the planet to fit the system. We need to change our systems to fit the planet.
Thanks.
Thank you. David, you're up, and Peter Bolkowski, you will be up next.
Okay, just talking about paradigm shifting, there is one of my questions was just about current events, and in the first quarter of 2023, planet-wide, what's the #1 selling car right now? Do you know?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Planet-wide, right now, what is the #1 selling car in the world right now? It's a current events question.
I don't know.
Tesla Model Y?
Yeah, Tesla Model Y. So the reason I brought that up, we're discussing paradigm shifting, and I just wanted to point out that we're not alone. To do these kind of changes requires a lot of people, a lot of participation. But just for the record, I wanted to say, well, most people are already on top of, the issues that we're talking about here and wanted to change. And honestly, would it were possible to sell them an electric car 10 years ago, they would have bought them 10 years ago. So the availability of options for people are not things that we can control. However, people's mindsets are in a pretty good place. The electric vehicles are going to dominate, which is going to solve a lot of the problems in the environment with, changing the atmosphere, with the extinction events that have occurred, and that kind of thing. And then the second question was about animals. Like, what do you suppose the chances are that humanity completely abandons the idea of domesticating animals and consuming animal products? Biologically speaking, as a non-biased analysis, we have the teeth of a herbivore. Biologically, we weren't even designed to eat meat. So what do you suppose the chances of humanity putting down domesticating animals completely and just getting it off the table?
Okay, two really great questions. So I thank you for that. So let's deal with them in reverse order, since you brought up the animal thing first, or last. The essence of what we really need to do is to understand that we've had tremendous gains from domestic animals. The productivity is phenomenal. That doesn't mean, and they're not just more productive, they're disease hardy. They will not contract as many diseases. And if we get them out of high density confinements, if we can get rid of these CAFOs, these concentrated animal feeding operations, and get them back onto the landscape where we have grass-fed beef, for example, grass-finished, it is volumes better, both for the environment and for us. We're consummate omnivores. We were evolved to be able to have a mixed diet. We need all of the above. So the regenerative agriculture component of this is interesting, but I don't think anybody is suggesting that we are going to drop all of our domestic animals. I don't think it's practical. I think it's a non-starter. It's a political hand grenade that nobody wants. And I don't think I'm a hunter, right? So, I think that we need to look at the big system and put it into context, which leads me back to your first excellent question about the prospect for changing transportation by converting our internal combustion engines, fossil fuel spewing, climate change generating transportation mode into something that's sustainable. So this is interesting because this is the scale of difference between a holistic, collaborative, goal and value and oriented approach versus just trying to tweak the current system. So the first question from a holistic and collaborative perspective is of transportation. Okay, so what's the goal? First of all, we have to ask, well, what's the goal, right? So if agriculture is about safe, nutritious, sustainable food, what about transportation? Well, it's pretty obvious. It's to move people and stuff. Even if it's just for fun, that's what it's for, move people and stuff.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what are the best ways of doing that? Well, the immediate answer is obviously the most efficient way to do it is mass transportation. If you do the actual math, trying to convert our existing internal combustion cars into electric cars is an environmental non-starter. This is not a solution. We have to massively, so we used to say reduce, reuse, recycle. The first is reduce. We have to reduce wasteful consumption of energy by having onesie, twosie, you're going to lose it, right? So I'm absolutely in favor of electric cars and the conversion, but it's not the solution. It's part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution if you look at this from the broad perspective that we need to.
Well, I mean,
Thank you. I'm going to, sorry, David, there's others here who need, and if you're able to hang around after we finish the tape, but there's a couple of more people I want to get in here before we turn the tape off.
Yeah, thanks for the pictures.
Peter, you'll be up, and Dave Doherty, you'll be on deck. Peter?
Hi, Peter Bulkowski here, 45 years in the oil and gas business and proud of it. So that's my background. I'm also Ukrainian. You've identified difficulties in implementing a collaborative approach based on comprehensive analysis and fundamental ethics within a Western society. How do you see such going internationally when you include totalitarian regimes such as Russia and Communist China, Iran, or North Korea?
Great question. And first of all, I need to acknowledge over and over again that I don't claim to have answers to much of this. I'm just one guy, and I'm not really an expert in anything because I can't stop looking at everything. So the essence, in my view, is to begin with the questions about, so what do we really value? And then, trying to figure out how we, what our examinations in the past have shown us. Everything from the public trust doctrine to the realization that, the risk presents the requirement for the precautionary approach. We have to have accountability. We have to have polluter pay principles. We have to have all of these things that people talk about now, but we're not doing any of them, right? We pretend that we're doing them. So, the essence of our governance, our media, our academia, everything that is involved in trying to protect public interest is completely compromised. So most of the tyrannical governments are, in places where, we've, as a global community, there has been this balance of terror. And, I don't think anybody is going to apologize for the appalling behaviors that are going on from some of these tyrants. But I'm also a student of political science and history. The United States invaded Iraq under a whole bunch of false pretenses to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And every single thing that they put forward was just nonsense. And they put Saddam Hussein in power. right? It was a product of the CIA, just like they had done in Iran. The CIA overthrew Mossadegh in 1953 and installed the Shah. This has happened over and over and over again. So the essence of tyranny is that you can see it in blatant examples, and you can look at Stalin, you can look at Hitler, you can look at Pol Pot, you can look at varieties all over the world. But just as insidious and more harmful to the planet, by far more harmful to humanity, has been this paradigmatic shift where we've created these systemic dysfunctions that have us facing imminent global collapse. The planet might do okay, but we're facing the same balance of terror that we've always had since the development of nuclear weapons. So, I just think these are great questions. I don't pretend to know how to deal with a whole bunch of the geopolitics that's going on, which is, it's essentially game theory. And if we keep playing game theory, which is win-lose, right? There's nothing that gets more competitive than that, right? We have to be grown-ups and be able to come together as a global society and say, we have to be able to remove the threat that is behind all of this. I don't think that the people in any of these societies have any different goals than us. Their values, I don't think, are different. They love their kids, their friends, their family. They want a healthy, sustainable future as well. We have to change the systems that are tyrannical all over the place.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dave, your question? And John Legg, you'll be up.
Okay, thanks, Ruben. I think you mentioned this fellow's name, actually. While at grad school, Dr. Val Geist was one of my profs, and he was convinced that farming elk was a really bad idea. This would be the very early 80s. Your data appear to make that pretty clear that he was correct. I was wondering whether the study of CJD has shown whether we are all at risk from prions in our food supply currently. Forgive me if I missed your comments on this during the presentation. I worked for a while at Health Canada, and one of the things that I took an interest in studying, it was in health economics, was the origins and probable extent of infection with CJD. And it was my fear at the time, from lots of reading, that in fact it was quite widespread, and people were refusing to acknowledge that it was problematic. This, by the way, just around the time that that England was dealing with its terrible outbreak.
So, interesting question. Val Geist was the stalwart against the game farming industry, but ironically, he was its first proponent. I don't know if you know that, but he actually organized the first International Wildlife Ranching Symposium at the University of Calgary in 1971. And it was in the process of reading the 57 papers that it generated that he threw his hands up and said, "This is the worst mistake I've ever made in my career," right? So the essence of what he put together, and I ended up at his door in the mid-1980s when the government was proposing this, because I was trying to complete an economic analysis. And although it made no economic sense, I couldn't complete the risk analysis until because I was hearing from biologists that there were all kinds of risks biologically and ecologically. So I showed up at his door asking him, saying, we've domesticated animals for thousands of years. What's the difference with these? And that's where he said, good question. We became friends, and he sent me down all these rabbit holes, introduced me to all these world leaders in a whole bunch of different areas, including Tom Thorne and Beth Williams. Beth Williams had proven that CWD was a TSE. Anyway, the CJD question. So this is a human form of prion disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It occurs naturally as probably a hereditary thing in about 1 in a million people. Now, your question is whether or not it might be being missed or not paid attention to. Laura Manuelides at Yale did an examination of people who were thought to have died of Alzheimer's. And there are a whole bunch of different dementias that fit into this. And of the Alzheimer's patients that were diagnosed that way to have died from it postmortem, it turned out that up to 13% didn't have Alzheimer's, they had CJD. So it may be more widespread, but it's not being diagnosed because most dementias are not diagnosed. The best authority for this, as far as I know, is Mike Coulthard at the Public Health Agency of Canada. He is a brilliant guy, and he is in charge of trying to track all of this stuff, not in no small part because he's watching for clusters that might indicate chronic wasting disease. So the what if question of, so what if this does transfer to people is a nightmare, because, you know, people, when we realized that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was not like SARS or MERS, that this was spreading before symptoms and sometimes with no symptoms. And then we suspected that, holy crap, this might be airborne, right? I was on the phone with epidemiologists. We were trying to guess if it was that and it was behaving like SARS, how many hundreds of millions of people were going to die, right? Well, we won the lottery because although it was airborne, the mortality rate was way down, about 1%, not 10 or 30. So we don't know what would happen with a prion disease, but forget, you know, having 2 weeks or whatever of being able to spread this. The indications are from the macaque studies, they took nearly 10 years to develop that disease in those monkeys, and we live 3.5 times longer. So what would happen if we could have a disease that you could spread? Saliva is the worst. It's worse than feces in terms of spreading it. With something, I mean, what would you do with the victims? You could spread it not just through kissing, but you can't sterilize the equipment. You know, humans have been transferred CJD with surgical instruments that were cleaned and put through an autoclave, right? You can't destroy these pathogens. When Paul Brown tried to find out, well, how much heat is going to be required, he took crucibles over a Bunsen burner and started cranking up the heat to find out what was going to be required to denature these proteins so that it wasn't infectious. You know, they knew because of autoclaves at, you know, multiple times boiling temperature that it was going to be high. It was 700 degrees that was required to do it. 600 degrees, it was still infectious. So 1100 Fahrenheit, just shy of the melting point of aluminum, the samples were reduced to white ash. The weights were 99% reduced. And when he reconstituted with saline, he infected 5 of 35 hamsters. This is what we're messing around with, right? So is it in the food supply? Absolutely. And one of my favorite papers is that there's no safe dose of prions. And we don't know how it's going to bioamplify within ecosystems. We know that there are all varieties of different rodents that are susceptible. So voles, meadow voles, redback voles, bank voles are called the universal acceptor of prion disease. If you remember the slide that I put up with Herman Schetzel's, that's one of the things that he used to do the bioassays to prove that it was actually CJD. Bank voles get any TSE that you can throw at them, scrapie, mad cow, doesn't matter. So, and there are bank voles, there are rodents all over the place. We simply don't know what this is going to do. So my hope is that this ultimate nightmare pandemic might be a wake-up call to do some analysis and figure out what we need to do.
It's interesting that you mentioned I think it was Manuelides study.
Sorry, I'm going to cut you off. We're three other people. I want to get into this before we close the tape, and I hope you can hang around. Thank you for letting me cut you off.
Yeah, Darrell, I'll send you an email.
Okay.
Well, and you can talk after we turn off the tape. John Ligg, you'll be up, at least you're on, and Ted Manning, you'll be up.
That was almost overwhelming, Darrell, your presentation, and I congratulate you for putting it forward. I'd like to stick to the holistic side, and in one sentence, here's the question. I'll amplify on it a little bit afterward. If one agrees that the principle of continuing to grow physical demands on a non-growing planet is deeply flawed, should we not try to get accepted the broad principle of stopping this growth? And I'll give one example only, and that's population. I won't go through the details, but I have them in my head. 1900, the year 1900, we were 1.5 billion. Then by the year 2000, we were 6. And I can give you the years for 7 and 8. Anyway, this is an idea, the principle of continuing to grow physical demands. If one could get accepted the broad principle of stopping the growth, the place to do it would be in the United Nations. And Vic Buxton was the first person who put forward that. He said, we need an environmental security council. Yes, we do. Anyway, there's the broad question. Continuing to grow demands on the planet. Why not try at least to push? I'm not saying we'll succeed, but why not push the principle of stopping growth of demands, physical demands on this planet? There we are.
So I agree wholeheartedly that we need to be examining growth in every form, including of populations. You know, I think the history shows that at the core of population growth, the factor that we can have the biggest influence on is poverty. So, you know, but we need all the tools in the kit. We need to be objectively looking at everything that we can to try to figure out what sustainability looks like. So, you know, the question is a profoundly important one. I don't, you know, people, Vic may have a lot better feel for this than I do. I just am ever mindful of the reality that it's not just the individual numbers of people, but it's the combination of numbers of people times their eco footprint, you know. So if we look at the impacts of developed countries versus non, you know, it was, when I was first looking at this, it was like we have 25 times more impact, we use more resources and contribute more pollution. But this goes back to the essence of accountability and all the things that people brag about in terms of, oh, we're developed countries, we don't, you know, we're so superior. In fact, we're paying the polluter. It's upside down, right? Yep. So we need to be able to have the means, and I don't know again whether it's the US, but we have to have the means of developing some kind of goals that people will agree with. That, okay, so we need to accept that numbers of people, this is our footprint, this is what we can do. This is why, for example, that when we're looking at things like transportation, we have to make the no-brainer decisions, you know, and some of them are simple. Like, I'd like somebody to explain to me in this day and age, maybe they can't see them in the smoke, but what the hell is the purpose of developing a skyscraper-sized hotel and then putting it in the ocean and pushing it around as a cruise ship? So if somebody can explain that, maybe they can help with the rest of the problems.
Thank you. And both Vic and I could give you some principles which do operate in the UN.
That'd be great.
Ruben?
Okay, over to Ted, please.
That's it.
Yeah, hi. You're trying to blame the cruise ships on me because I do work with the cruise industry. And yeah, defusing them is always a challenge. But the interesting thing is I very much appreciated your discussion because it talks about major advances in our understanding of the relationships between elements of the environment and people and survival and so forth. And very often I have found that it was encapsulated into physical silos, in physical science silos, into social science silos, and so on. But it's clear that the physical scientists, the analysts, the technologists have made signal advances in stuff that could make a difference. And the example I used in my question, I was at a conference in Florida last fall, and a scientist from Tufts actually brought meat to us and said, "We've produced this, try it." And he had the audience taste it, and it was indistinguishable from decent steak. And he was going to put it on my plate for $3 a pound. So the technical impact has now been addressed. I'm finding, however, that the social impact, getting people to actually accept change, getting people to even understand that change is necessary, is really a challenge. And so your last answer and what you were just talking about with John is, how do we in fact get people together to actually accept and understand that change is necessary? Because right now it strikes me that that is probably the single most important brick wall to run at.
So yeah, I concur. The meat question, I don't know if the one you were talking about is some of the vegetable-based meat, but beyond.
This is one coming out of Tufts where they're reconstituting directly from the chemicals.
Okay, is this the bacteria-driven one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So enjoy your bacteria. It may be good for you.
Yeah. I don't really know. I think that there has to be a lot of work done with respect to, just substituting out. We really don't know what the long-term effects are. We don't know about essential amino acids or phytotoxins and all of the issues of metabolism are really now being put together slowly. But there needs to be a whole stem to stern kind of a value stream examination of where, if this was proposed, where are the base ingredients going to come from, right? What are the consequences of mass production? Is it really going to help restore the vital ecosystems that we need to restore? And there's just some questions off the top of my head. I've never tried this kind of meat. I think it's kind of interesting. Yeah. All I can say is that we're going to need all hands on deck to be able to use the best science that we can to achieve legitimate goals while avoiding the problems that we're not. And the other point that I would make is that the failure that we've had, as much as anything, is trying to to use the same system, but somehow just make the avoid side pay. Like carbon capture storage was always nonsense. It was always going to be nonsense. It doesn't, it leaves all the dysfunctional systems still in place. Right. So I don't know beyond that, but excellent questions. And my apologies about the comment about the cruise ship.
Well, that's okay. I like them, but they're too damn big and their impacts are very negative. And we'll give you a talk again in a year or so about how we're trying to fix that again.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to draw this to a close and turn this over to Jean for a minute, but I'll take the prerogative of being the MC just briefly to point out that the timing of this could not have been better, Darrell, because the KCOR board is thinking about its own future. And one of the things you have put on the table for the KCOR board to think about is, should KCOR accept any responsibility to become a body in Canada that uses what energy and contacts that we have to lobby for the kind of comprehensive and systemic, the capacity to do the comprehensive capacity systemic analysis that that you've called for, because it doesn't exist in Canada. You're quite right. It doesn't exist here. It doesn't exist anywhere in the world that I know, that at least not a body larger than a philosophy department. As we all know, philosophy departments may impact the world occasionally, but it's over very long time frames. That's one thing that you have put on our agenda, and possibly the agenda of other organizations that are represented here. Secondly, that work, it seems to me, and you've helped clarify it in my own mind, is much deeper and closer to, if you like, the distinction we make between the pure sciences and the applied sciences. This is not immediately applied work. This is immediately to understand things, how they work together well enough that we can offer sound advice. The Cascade Institute of Thomas Homer Dixon is using complexity to try to identify things governments and others could do now in kind of an emergency way. And I don't despise that, but I hear you calling for something that is even more fundamental and more integrated than what TAD is doing there. That is not in any way to despise what he's doing. The situation that we're in, we should be doing all of the things that we can find the energy and money for. Finally, I have preempted Rosemary's comment, but it's in the chat. And her comment was that the roots of a lot of this are in greed. And the last comment raised by Ted, as well as some of the others and your own comments, make it clear that we're not just in what we think of as a classically scientific problem. We are facing a human condition in a culture that long ago decided it wasn't interested in an integrated view of humanity. It was more interested in exploring the earth than persons, and persons were set aside. We were subjects, not objects for study. And that decision, and that made so many 100 years ago, is now reaching its fruition in a way that's quite destructive. And so you have informed us, you've done everything we asked you to do. Jean, over to you.
Thank you, Ruben. And Darrell, thank you very much for an absolutely amazing talk. I can say categorically from my own perspective, as a person who is currently suffering day one from COVID, I was on the couch listening to this rather than actively, and I didn't fall asleep. So that was absolutely wonderful. And thank you. Thank you so much for an absolutely amazing talk. I'm looking at the chats and all the comments that are being made. You've brought so many things together in a very focused and a very disciplined way. And it was really, really an engaging presentation. So on behalf of KCOR and all of the people here, I would like to thank you very much for what you did for us today. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
That is definitely our pleasure. And for those of you who are still with us, I would like to say thank you for coming to this particular presentation. And if you would like to see this again, and I strongly recommend to everyone that you go and listen to this presentation again, you can find it on our video page on our website at canadiancore.com. You can also get invitations to this particular presentation once it's online. And if you go to the Stay Informed section and log into that and become part of our informed group, you will get invitation to this and other videos that we've had online. You can also find more information about us as an organization. If you wish to join us, if you want to find out more about us, that information is also on our website, canadiancore.com. So again, thank you very much for this absolutely wonderful presentation, Darrell, and I look forward to listening to it again. Thank you.
Thanks.